Welcome to today's episode of People in Strategy. I'm your host, Mo Fathelbab, President of International Facilitators Organization. People in Strategy is a podcast from the SHRM Executive Network, the premier network of executives in the field of human resources. Each week, we bring you in-depth conversations with the country's top HR executives and thought leaders. For today's conversation, I'm excited to be joined by Susan Schmitt Winchester, a former HR leader at the Kellogg Company and CHRO at Rockwell Automation and Applied Material. She's also founder of Susan J. Schmitt Winchester and Associates, LLC, and she has recently published a book called Healing at Work. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you, Mo. It's great to be here. Thank you so much.
Great to have you with us. Susan, tell us about your career journey and what brought you to the field of HR.
I'm very, very blessed that HR was the path that I pursued. And it was purely by, sort of an accident, right? I was in college. I was going to get my degree. I had a double major in psychology and French. And I remember standing in the psychology department one morning thinking, what in the heck am I going to do after I graduate? And I found a posting for a master's degree program in industrial organizational psychology on the bulletin board. And I thought, I think that's where I'm supposed to go after college. I did basically a master's degree, and the program was obviously very geared towards people in the workplace, and it had a heavy quantitative side of it as well. So my very first job out of graduate school was working as a compensation analyst in Chicago for, at that time, was a small family-owned company called Helene Curtis that was eventually bought by Unilever. And that began my whole journey.
Love it. Well, we're lucky to have you with us because we're going to talk about hiring. And obviously, it is one of the big challenges for HR leaders. It's costly both in terms of time and money. So how can HR leaders make smarter talent decisions during the hiring process?
This is such an important question. And, I think the benefit of all the years of experience that I've had, 36 years in corporate HR, has enabled me to see and reflect on some of the practices that we brought to our companies to really challenge myself. Are these practices really making a difference? Or are there other ways that we could be doing things to create more value? I think most HR people care deeply about being meaningful and providing meaningful direction to our leaders. And when I moved from Kellogg's to Rockwell, I had an opportunity to really think back about all the things that we did at Kellogg. And every company is doing its very best with the best of intentions to serve the people and the company and the stakeholders. But I remember when I was working there that I would really be frustrated by lots of things related to people being matched to jobs or not getting an opportunity that they thought they deserved. And of course, we, like many companies, relied on what I would describe as the leadership competency model. But I found that the competency models, while certainly better than not having something to use as a basis, I felt that they were sometimes too vague. They'd talk about need to be a strategic leader, which in my head, I'm thinking, okay, a strategic leader in terms of doing a 12-month strategy or a 20-year strategy, that's a very different proposition. And I also felt like sometimes leaders got promoted that didn't necessarily demonstrate all the competencies. So somebody who created huge value but had an aggressive approach to how they did it still was selected to move into the role. And of course, I think many of us as managers ourselves in HR, as well as working with the people we work with, hire people into jobs thinking it's going to be a great match, and it ends up being bust. We end up, unfortunately, firing too many people that we thought through our interview and selection process was going to result in a great match, and it doesn't. So I think that this, kind of reflecting back on my own experience, recognizing that the number one reason people leave their job is because they perceive their career advancement is not going at the pace that they want it to. I think most HR leaders are familiar with people coming to them saying, hey, why am I not getting promoted? And it's very difficult sometimes to be able to articulate that. And so the way that HR leaders can really start to raise the game on not only their own ability, but also the leaders that we're supporting when they're going through selection processes by understanding the framework that I call the Suitability Model, which is really all about how do you match the best suited people into the roles that you have available. whether it's through the selection process, which we can talk more about, whether it's promotion processes that you have in your company, succession planning. How do you really know where to focus someone's development? Sometimes that's not always really clear what's going to really make a difference, as well as being able to explain to any employee what's going on in their career, what's working, what's not, and what do they need to do differently. And the framework around suitability enables all of this. And it was such a game changer.
Please tell us. Yes, I understand. There are 4 pillars to the suitability model. Let's hear them.
The first one's a really obvious one. In fact, many of us over-focus on the first one. The first pillar is a combination of skills, knowledge, experience, and education. So skills is learning how to do specific things. The knowledge is knowing how to apply it. The experience is knowing what really works. We often spend a lot of time assessing someone's skills, knowledge, experience, and education for the role because we can see it in the resume. We can ask people about their different skills and experiences. However, I am sure that all of us can describe examples of where somebody had all of the required for a role and still failed.
Sure.
And just a quick story, I won't say which company, but years ago I had a head of HR who had all the skills, knowledge, experience, and education you would expect a chief HR officer to have. If I had any technical questions, I could go to him and he would be able to answer those questions with a great deal of confidence. However, he was fired after only 14 months. So even though he had all the skills, knowledge, experience, and education to do the job, there were some gaps on some of these other 3 elements I'm going to talk to you about. So is important, but it's not the only thing that matters. The second pillar of the suitability model, I call it capacity for complexity. And it recognizes that work varies in complexity and people's ability to handle complexity also varies. So, for example, I often, when I'm speaking to audiences, like we are today, I say, I want you to imagine and remember the very first job you ever got paid for and tell me how complex it was. So people will say, well, I was a paper boy. I deliver papers for people, throwing the paper on the front porch, whatever. My first job was working at a fast food restaurant. And so the complexity was very basic. Pack the food, take the money, get the orders, clean the restaurant. And the only decision we had to make, but it was all prescribed on the wall, was how many salads would we make tomorrow? If it was during the week, it was a certain number. If it was a weekend, it was a bigger number. That was it. Any issues that came up in the store got escalated. And then I have people imagine, well, what's the job you're doing today? Can you tell me the difference in the complexity you're handling versus that original job? So it gets people thinking about work complexity. And it's really key. This often gets overlooked in selection practices, is really understanding what are the factors of complexity of this job? What are the factors of complexity around how far out in the future does someone have to plan? What are the risks they have to manage? What's the complexity of the stakeholder group they're managing? What's the impact of their decisions? You can define factors of complexity in a lot of different ways. But if you end up putting somebody in a job and they're too small for the job, it's a mismatch. They're not the best suited person. Because if they're too small for the job, they're going to get overwhelmed by the complexity.
That makes sense.
Also,
so 1 second. So how do you test for somebody's ability to handle complexity?
Well, the first step is really defining the role and what are the factors of complexity in the role that you want to put them into. And a lot of times we don't take enough time and due diligence to really define, well, what are the factors of complexity? What's the level of innovation? Do they need to innovate new processes or do they need to innovate new business models? So really spending time defining the complexity of the work before you start to assess someone's capability to do it. When you're assessing someone's capability, if it's somebody you don't know, it just takes a little bit more diligence. There are different questions that you can ask in a selection process to get at understanding the work that they were doing and the complexity of that work. So, for example, asking questions like, tell me your top 3 career accomplishments of your entire life in terms of the work that you were doing. People will typically describe things that were really hard that they overcame. And so the person that's doing the interviewing obviously has to demonstrate some judgment and discretion about listening for the level of work. And by the way, there's a whole model behind this. So We don't have time to go into all the details behind the different levels of work complexity. This is part of Dr. Jacks's brilliance, was defining 7 different levels of differentiated value that are being created by different levels of work. But to understand the person's capability, you, first of all, as a team, you understand what's this complexity of this job. So at one of my companies, we had a CFO opening. We had internal candidates and external candidates. We really described the complexity that needed to be managed. And then when we did the interview process, we would ask questions to understand the depth and breadth of the problems they've solved before, to get a sense about their capability around complexity. And then, of course, there are always external assessments that can help validate the internal data. So I like using tools around the suitability model, which, I've got a whole selection guide of questions developed over the years to help get at all these core elements of suitability. The issues around complexity are understanding what's the most difficult problem you've ever had to solve. Tell me about the most complex issue you've ever had to resolve. And you learn how to listen to the different levels of complexity because each one of us has like binoculars of the world. Some people are seeing into the future, the conceptual, intuitive, forward-thinking people. Many of us are thinking at a more operational, concrete, tangible level. You can teach people how to listen for these different levels of work capability based on the suitability model. So that's how you do it.
Thank you.
It's actually not that hard, but it just takes time and training to understand how to do it.
Of course.
The third element, the third pillar, which is my personal favorite, is called temperament. And it acknowledges that every one of us has a nature in terms of how we show up in the world and how we show up at work. And we all have pluses and we all have minuses. And we all have good days and we all have bad days. And the whole point of looking at a person's temperament as an interviewer is understanding both pluses and minuses, and then making a decision about what are the minuses that we can live with. There's never a perfect candidate ever. But it's really important to understand and be aware of what are some of the downsides if we bring this person in relative to their temperament. So, for example, I taught the suitability model to the church that I belonged to years ago when we were doing a pastor search. So it was a fairly complex church, but one of the elements of temperament of the candidate that we were interviewing was this particular leader, this pastor, was very affiliative. He obviously cared deeply about people. And so that's a very positive element of temperament, but sometimes our strengths overplay can be our biggest weaknesses. And so one of the potential downsides is someone who's really strong on wanting people to be very affiliative, very empathetic, is that they can be too nice. And so sometimes they have a harder decision stepping into difficult situations. And, so we wanted to really make sure, because we had some complex issues happening in the church, that whoever came in could hold his or her ground relative to managing some of the tension that was happening and not try to facilitate it to try to make everybody happy, because that's not always able to do that. And actually, it's the same thing with CEO succession. Having been a part of CEO succession on a number of occasions, there are a lot of people in the organization who feel that they should be the future CEO. And maybe they have the ski to do it. And let's just say they have the capacity for complexity. I could list off 5 or 6 names right off the top of my head of leaders who didn't get that CEO job because they were too nice. They had a hard time making tough decisions about people. So that temperament piece is really understanding and looking at what are their pluses and minuses, and can we live with the minuses? And then the fourth category is accepts role requirements. And it really just acknowledges that every job has a set of obligations and demands. And it's important to articulate those for the candidate that's being considered so that they know full on going into the role what they are expected to do. Those obligations and demands could be being available 24 hours a day, working on weekends, lots of travel, maybe an expat assignment in a different country, maybe working in an isolated area. It doesn't matter what it is. What matters is the person that you are interviewing interested and willing to take on those obligations and demands. So those 4 things together make the suitability model. And I love it because it is simple to teach. I can easily teach the work levels model behind the factors of complexity. There's a whole model behind that. And as leaders and HR people become more aware of these 4 key elements, they're better able to identify where there may be some gaps, but they're more aware of what they're going to get so that they can plan for it.
So, Susan, how did you measure the success of applying this wonderful model?
Well, a lot of it was based on the leaders and executives' response to the model. So for example, at one of my companies, when we were implementing suitability model, we had a 3-year rollout planned. We were going to start with development, start easy. How do you teach people what they need to focus on from a development standpoint? So we rolled out, a piece around employees understanding suitability model, how they could use that to understand their development areas, and we taught managers how to have conversations with employees. And I remember presenting to a group of vice presidents what our plan was. We're going to do this, we're going to do this. We had selection planned for 3 years down the road because I didn't want to rush it. I wanted people to get comfortable with the model. I needed HR to get comfortable. It was very different than competencies. And I'll never forget one of the vice presidents standing up in the audience saying, "We need selection now. Can you accelerate your schedule?" So how I gauged the success of the model and its impact was really through the eyes of the leaders that I was working with. And so, for example, the CEOs, both the CEOs, 3 CEOs that I worked with, um, who would use the suitability model for succession planning and thinking about who's got capability for complexity here, what do we project their capability is in the future. And Dr. Jacks created some amazing models of how you can predict that out based on where someone's operating today, based on how many years they've been in their career. And it's really, it's really elegant how you can take some of these tools. And it was really through the leaders saying, this has changed our discussion on how we communicate with people about A, what they need to focus on for development, B, whether or not we think they're going to be a viable candidate to go up higher in the organization. Sometimes the conversation was about this is a mismatch of suitability. So we had to transition people out. But using that framework of those 4 pillars that we just talked about, you could very easily diagnose what was working or not working and be able to support leaders and having very difficult conversations if something wasn't working. But it became less personal and more clear why something wasn't working. Not everybody liked it because if the leadership, the manager once removed, believe that that person was really at their maximal level of capability, they may opt out on their own and go find something that they perceive to be better. Some people seek titles, bigger titles, more money, more perceived power, or whatever. But we all know that a lot of people get over promoted up into those ranks. They're being paid to deliver value at a different level than they were at a lower. But if they're not able to make that jump up in complexity, then the company is spending money that's actually not a good use of the cost for the managerial structure.
Yeah. Great model. Thank you. I hope that many of our audience members can use it and benefit from it. It just makes all the sense in the world. I want to shift the conversation and talk about your book. And specifically, the title was very much of interest to me, Emotional Healing in the Workplace. So let's start with kind of your thesis as to how it is that there's emotional healing in the workplace.
Right. So the book is, my co-author Martha and I call it Healing at Work, a guide to using career conflicts to overcome your past and build the future you deserve. And it's really based on my own journey in the corporate world for so many years. And what's hard for me to admit, but I willingly admit it because it's key to helping people on this journey also, is that 30 years of my 36-year career, my successes were fueled by my underlying belief that I wasn't good enough.
Mm.
And I went into work every single day believing that I had to prove myself over and over and over and over. I had a belief that it was everybody else's job to determine my worth and value, and my job was to be as perfect and as people-pleasing as possible. And I would say that while I had some amazing experiences in my career, I had a lot of really self-induced stress and anxiety and worry that was culminating because of things that I experienced when I was little. And so Martha and I wrote the book. We did a ton of research and discovered a really interesting statistic. A study was done in the late 90s by Kaiser Permanente and the CDC. They worked with two doctors, Felipe and Anda. And they were interested in asking adults, they asked adults in the US to answer a survey. And on the survey, they listed 10 traumatic events that can happen to kids before the age of 18. They call them the adverse childhood events, ACEs. And they were shocked when they got back the results that of the 17,000 people they asked, did you experience any of these traumas? 67%, nearly 67% said they had experienced at least one of those. 40% had experienced two or more. And then there's a group of us, me included, that experienced four or more.
Hmm.
And I will tell you, in my own mind, I never thought of my childhood as dysfunctional. I mean, there's a lot of hype around that. And I knew people had it far worse than I did. But the dynamic in my childhood, with no blame towards either of my parents, I think our parents do the very best that they can. But my dad had a tendency for unpredictable rage, which could be very scary. He was a big man. I was quite little. And I came to believe that I was the cause of his anger.
Hmm.
And so unconsciously, I came into my career thinking, oh, I'm an adult now. I have a master's degree. I should be just fine. For, like I said, first 30 years of my career, I was living in this unconscious state of understanding how much my past relationship with my dad and the beliefs I took away about myself and other people influenced every single thing that was happening to me at work. It influenced how I felt about myself. You're not good enough. It influenced how I thought about other people and how I interpreted them, which led to a lot of anxiety and fear. But then my coping strategies were all around trying to be as perfect as possible. Because if I could be just perfect, there's sort of that walking on eggshells, hypervigilant, always anticipating what could go wrong, then I could create a sense of predictability and safety in my environment. And with Martha's help on this journey, I started to realize that so many of people's experiences at work are literally being fueled from things that happened to them when they were younger. When I see myself, or when I would see leaders overreacting, like the reaction was way out of base with what had happened, it began to culminate into this work that Martha and I did and all the research on neuroplasticity, understanding how we can reshape the brain and the neural networks in our brain, and bringing in positive psychology and focusing on positive things. We could leverage these things to help people start to heal from their own dysfunctional past, particularly in moments when we collide with one another at work, which is when that happens. We all know that feeling. We've just crashed into somebody and we become emotionally upset or activated or wound up or triggered, whatever word you want to use. And my experience of it was this feeling of, if somebody was angry at me, or I was being judged or rejected or left out, I would go into a quick unconscious spiral into a state of rumination. What did I do? What should I have done? Oh my gosh, I can't believe I said that in a meeting. I can't believe I didn't say this in a meeting. What's wrong with me? And that would lead to my nervous system being on high alert. And the way I managed it was not healthy, was to drink. And what I found in this work is how many of us overachieving perfectionists, especially in HR, wanting to take care of everybody, but also the leaders we're working with, we're experiencing some of these same dynamics of this spiral down. And I, in the work with Martha, as we wrote the book, began to realize so we can actually use those moments of conflict. On the book that we have two bumper cars facing off. And unfortunately, that's what conflict feels like at work sometimes, is that we're bumping into, crashing into one another. And it's easy to go into that pit of suffering. And what I realized was, if we could turn this around, if we could spend less time in that pit of painful emotion, worry, stress, fear, I'm going to get fired, whatever, and teach people how to move off that unconscious, wounded career path, where I was completely unaware of how much that past was influencing everything. Teach people how to take back control. I have a really simple 3-step method, which I can explain in a minute, to help them step back onto the conscious healing career path, where we're not constantly beating ourselves up, where we learn how to set healthy boundaries around working and not overworking, where we learn how to make choices that we are focused on taking care of ourselves. And so what Martha and I coined was this concept of you can use workplace conflict as your own laboratory for emotional healing. It's like a clue. If you and I have a crash and I perceive that you're angry at me or think I've disappointed you, whatever it is to say, okay, wait, my 3-step process is first of all, step back and say, I've got to create some choice. Our brains are it's in that fight, flight, or freeze mode where we feel threatened. The amygdala, that little almond-shaped part of our brain, the reptilian brain that people call it. I think most people are in their reptilian brain at work. And you see the fight, flight, freeze, please behavior all the time. Fight are the bullies. Freeze are the people that are trying to stay off the radar, not wanting to be seen. Flight are the people that are leaving the company because they're too frustrated with their boss. And then those of us who are the pleasers, spending all of our energy trying to get somebody else to validate us. It's like an unbelievable, unproductive, painful place to be that we don't have to be. And that's what Martha and I unwind in the book is how do you actually take those moments and use them for your good and to move out of that state of suffering into a state of not suffering and actually finding joy. But I'm very passionate about teaching people they can totally change the game of their work experience.
Well, Susan, that was incredibly generous and vulnerable of you to share that with our audience. So, Susan, what's one piece of advice you would have for the readers of your wonderful book?
Sure. One piece of advice is when you're feeling stressed out or in that moment of a bumper car crash yourself, ask yourself one simple question. Am I sure? So, for example, if you see your boss looking at you in a way that you think is negative and that you conclude that he's going to fire you, say to yourself, am I sure? Maybe my boss is just having a bad day. It's a very powerful, simple question that helps you check your own internal story against reality. So that's one small piece of advice. And I would also highlight, I've got a very short 9-minute TEDx talk where it's called Tackling Perfectionism. And it's a super quick watch. And I also go into a couple other ideas of things people can do.
Wonderful. And last question, Susan, what is one piece of advice that you received that has shaped your work or personal life?
One piece of advice that I received, which was hard at first to really integrate, is the idea that every single person we come into contact with that causes us to have that emotional reaction, to be upset by or triggered by, the advice I got was to recognize that that person is really just an avatar helping you to learn a lesson that you need to learn. And so if you're confronted with somebody that's very angry, so angry authority people was a huge trigger for me, that rather than, blaming them, judging them, staying in a state of victim, when we judge or blame others, we are completely giving away our control and power, is to think to ourselves, what is the gift that this person's giving me? Sometimes this avatar ideas, they're here to teach me something about myself. And also remembering that their behavior is about them. I'm responsible for my response.
Thank you. And that's where we'll wrap it up for this episode of People and Strategy. Again, a huge thanks to Susan for your valuable insights. You can follow the People and Strategy podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Also, podcast reviews have a real impact on podcast visibility. So if you enjoyed today's episode, leave a review to help others find the show. Finally, you could find all our episodes on our website at shrm.org/podcasts. Thank you for listening and have a great day.
SHRM.